Let's talk through the rules for the Unforgiven and 10th edition, unique datasheets for the Dark Angels, Deathwing, Ravenwing, and command structure, big stratagems for some massive lethal hits and returning fire, and oddly enough, the army really enjoys Battle Shock. Let's talk through the rules for Index Dark Angels. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Dark Angels. It seems that Games Workshop have given us the indexes for the Divergent chapters on Monday, all the datasheets and their launch detachments for how they're going to play in 10th edition. Following a vote on the channel's Patreon page, looks like we're going for Dark Angels, then Blood Angels, Black Templars, Space Wolves, then Death Watch in that order, and I'll try and do as many as I can today. In any case, the Dark Angels are pretty exciting right now. They've just had their Primarch return to the 41st millennium, plus a nice new Azrael miniature. They'll certainly be enjoying some nice new Embiggened Terminator sculpts, and it seems kind of likely that they might get a Black Templar style range refresh when their codex drops early next year. In the meantime though, let's see what they've got for rules in 10th edition, and what sort of fancy toys the Ravenwing, Deathwing and friends can bring to the table. For the contents of Index Dark Angels, looks like there's no faction rule reprinted here. Looks like you just use Oath of Moment from the core Space Marine rules, so they haven't had two copies of it. Instead, the main thing that's here is their Unforgiven Task Force. That's the Dark Angels launch detachment with Grim Resolve. There is a restriction on it that says that only Dark Angels chapter specific units can be used in it, so you can't use things like Sanguinary Guard or Pedro Cantor or Gilliman or anything. But it looks like you do have access to the full amount of Space Marine datasheets, no restrictions at all there. Otherwise, there's the usual choice of 6 stratagems and 4 enhancements, 18 datasheets here for all the unique Dark Angels ones. There have been a couple that have been gained or lost, and I guess that might well mean that the Codex Space Marine ones might not be included in the Dark Angels index card set. I guess we'll wait and see on that front, but I think it might be helpful if they did put them in. Otherwise, with this index, it looks like there's absolutely no restrictions on Dark Angels units using the Gladius Task Force. I had kind of wondered if unique stuff like Deathwing Units or Ravenwing Units might have been excluded, but it looks like they're not. You can run all of their unique characters and units in the Gladius, arguably making these successor chapters perhaps a little bit better for that kind of formation. I think it's going to be hard not to see the Gladius Force as kind of superior for these Divergent chapters, given that they just have access to a bunch more units over the generic ones. The only real draw to say playing Imperial Fists or Iron Hands or something is their unique character datasheets, which they don't have a lot of. Otherwise, we're still waiting on points and combat patrol rules. Until then, we can't really judge the relative benefits of things, but we can certainly understand the rules and how the army is going to be fitting together. Starting out, as with Space Marines, they will have Oath of Moment, very powerful damage buff rule for taking down one tough enemy target each turn. All your units get to reroll hits and wound rolls chosen in the command phase, provided they're attacking one marked target. Massively efficient damage buff, somewhere between 50 and 100% damage increase, will be really nice on mid-strength things versus just about anything. Great for things like Strength 8 Power Fists, or maybe Dark Angels Overcharged Plasma might be relevant for them. As with standard Space Marines, better against some armies than others. Really nice if they've got big tough targets to get your teeth into, less so if there's loads of small things hiding. And will be better for certain units than others, really nice with devastating wounds, less good with twin links. Overall, it's a fairly solid rule, and it'll tie a lot of Space Marines together. Onto actual Dark Angels stuff though, and their launch detachment is called the Unforgiven Task Force. Thematically to me this feels like a force themed around the green Dark Angels. Neither Deathwing nor Ravenwing are particularly well supported here. Obviously you'll get access to all their unique units and datasheets, which will definitely add a bunch of flavour and power, but they don't really have many specific stratagems and things. I guess they'll be coming in more Deathwing or Ravenwing themed armies. When the codex drops, I'd be amazed if the Dark Angels didn't have a detachment themed around both of those. Another running theme of it seems to be that this is the formation that just really doesn't care about battle shock, and indeed fights harder and gets better when a lot of their units have it. Still not going to be an out and out positive, as it might give you issues with falling back or using stratagems, but it is kind of surprising just how many of these stratagems, enhancements, and a few datasheets might be helped out by the Dark Angels being battle shocked. Some of these detachments are going to have restrictions on the units that you can take. This one doesn't really have all that much, to be honest. The only thing is that you can't use the other named chapter things in this formation, so you can't use things like Blood Angel's Sanguinary Guard or Rebute Gilliman in this force. Kind of to be expected really if this is the Dark Angels one. You just allowed the generic datasheets from Codex Space Marines and anything that's unique to the Dark Angels with their chapter tag. Technically, it's not really tied to any given paint rules. If you really wanted, you could paint an entire army of Ultramarines. Just don't use any specific datasheets for any chapter whatsoever and no epic heroes, and then just run them with the Unforgiven Task Force. If you did think that it reflected your lore or fighting style a bit better, or you wanted to try out a different style of play. you'd just be locked out to not using any epic heroes besides things from Dark Angels. Otherwise though, there's literally no restrictions on the datasheets that you can take from generic Codex Space Marines. Previously Dark Angels were banned from using Stern Guard or Vanguard veterans, so I guess Dark Angels forces have kind of gained those from 9th. Finally, once you actually use this attachment, the Dark Angels gain the Grim Resolve rule. This one was previewed on Warhammer Community, and it basically means that it's a bit of insurance against battle shock. While an Adeptus Astartes unit from your army is battle shocked, change the objective control characteristic of models to 1 instead of 0. Means that if you've got a lone unit that's holding an objective, they won't just be completely unable to take it, they'll just be down to 1 instead. This is what you get in place of the combat doctrines from the Gladius Task Force, plus access to the stratagems, and I must admit I'm a little bit underwhelmed by this rule. It's definitely not nothing, and occasionally it might earn you a few victory points if, say, a far-flung unit fails battle shock unexpectedly, but I think in reality it's just really not going to be that impactful most of the time. A lot of the time you might have 2 units on the objective anyway, so that wouldn't exactly matter. Some of the time your opponent might have been out-competing you on objective control points anyway, and if it really does make the difference of victory points, you could always cancel it just for 1 command point with Insane Bravery, at least on the unit that matters most. Any army in the game can do that, and that means that a lot of the time this rule just might occasionally save you a command point here and there, though potentially might not do so all game long. Overall, a bit underwhelmed by this one. I feel like the draw to the detachment is pretty much certainly going to come from the stratagems and enhancements as opposed to this rule. Talking of which though, a lot of the stratagems are really quite cool. Going through them, for 1 command point we've got Unforgiven Fury. This one gives lethal hits on any unit for 1 command point, and they go off on a 5+ for critical hits if any friendly Adeptus Astartes units in your army are currently battle shocked. This one seems really quite a lot easier to trigger than a few of the other special rules in the detachment which require the unit in question to be battle shocked. Later in the game I think it's at least somewhat likely some of your units might be, and at that point 1 command point for auto wounds 5+ on anything seems pretty awesome to me. It means that literally anything that uses this stratagem will stack a whole bunch of saves on anything, and even more so if you've got some other special rule that can get you full hit rerolls. There are a couple of those out there in the generic datasheets. Accessing lethal hits every so often could also just be worth it just in general if you desperately need to plink the last few wounds off a big tough monster or something. Intractable is also 1 command point. This one allows you to fall back, shoot and charge with your unit, basically Gladius style tactical doctrine when you need it, but costing 1 CP. A little bit situational as it means that your opponent and you have to be locked in combat and neither kill each other, but in Warhammer 40k and just the general cut and thrust of combat, it's absolutely going to be well worth using in quite a lot of places I think. Certainly good for shooting units that get locked up in combat and just need to fall back to be able to fire. Really quite cool on big durable things moving forward as well, say like Terminators getting stuck into the foe, they could fall back, shoot and charge something. Or potentially fast moving Ravenwing units like the Black Knights, they'd certainly enjoy falling back, shooting those plasma talons, and then charging the most critical target that they can find. Again, very usable, great utility when you need it. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Armour of Contempt, which is just a copy and paste from the Gladius Force. This one's worsening AP by -1 against your units, and you can use it in either the shooting or the fight phase. Definitely solid enough to have a bit of reactive durability on the go, very meaningful versus AP1 or AP2 weapons in particular. Might compete a little bit with go to ground against shooting, which is basically a better stratagem against things that don't ignore cover, but you could potentially stack it, and this one can be used in melee. Again, very good value, particularly if a unit just desperately needs to cling to life on an objective. The next one is Fire Discipline, and this one's a bit more of a utility one once more. In the shooting phase, gain Assault Heavy and ignores cover on your weapons, so this one's going to be a fairly decent utility boost to shooting. Quite nice in that it gives any one Dark Angels unit access to advance and shoot without the need for the Gladius combat doctrines. Sometimes that's going to be worth it for the CP alone, if say it makes the difference between you getting range with a big tank with a whole ton of guns, or getting a line of sight on the thing that you actually need to kill. Otherwise, Heavy can grant +1 to hit if you're stationary, and ignores cover will be handy in 10th edition quite a bit I think. Cover saves are fairly easy to come by, at least compared with 9th. I'd say again very usable utility, maybe just a little bit less standout than a few of the others. Next up we've got one called Grim Retribution. This one's 1 command point, and it's basically return fire at full ballistic skill against the enemy that just shot you. The only stipulation is that the enemy shooting must have killed at least one Astartes model, so you must have taken a casualty. It means that realistically it doesn't happen on things like big vehicles and things, and you're not going to quite get a full squad shooting out of it. If the enemy allocates their fire a little bit boldly though, and just say kills one Hellblaster out of a big squad, you could very well just turn around and just blast them to death with the rest of the unit. Really quite a scary thing to have in the defensive arsenal, absolutely one that could have an enormous damage potential return for 1 CP. Finally, for the Dark Angels, we've got Unbreakable Lines, really quite a heavy durability one this one. You have to declare this in the charge phase when the opponent charges you. When the enemy unit contacts them, that unit gets -1 damage on their melee weapons, really quite a big deal. Perhaps most effective against damage 2 weapons going down to damage 1 against your 2 wound infantry, or damage 3 dropping to damage 2. Currently still rules as written, damage 1 weapons will drop to damage 0 in 10th edition. There's nothing that prevents that. I have a suspicion though that that's probably going to get FAQ'd. I think it's probably just a missed rule on Games Workshop's part. I guess we'll see though. Potentially this could make them functionally immune to damage 1 attacks in combat, which of course is utterly ludicrous for 1 CP. Overall, I feel like that's a really quite powerful set of stratagems there. I think just for generating raw power, Grim Retribution to shoot back, and Unbreakable Lines, these two, they might be some of the biggest swings that you can get to the game just for 1 CP. The more movement and utility based ones, I think will still see a lot of use just out of necessity though. Overall, I think it's a fairly strong collection of stratagems. Maybe just a little bit disappointing not to see Weapons of the Dark Age make a return there. Looks like Dark Angels aren't getting their +1 damage on plasma anytime soon. Maybe it'll make a return in some way in the Dark Angels Codex. Otherwise, we've got 4 enhancements for your characters. Most of these can be taken on basically any Space Marine character that isn't an epic hero. The only restriction is the Relic Banner one. First up, the Shroud of Heroes. It looks like a very good one. When the model's killed the first time, you have a 2+ chance to resurrect on 3 wounds remaining. Really quite massively powerful, seeing as that basically means if the opponent slays them during their charge and fight phase, they get up at the end of the phase and they're out of combat, they should have a turn of acting and fighting before they go down again for guarantees. That's really quite big on any character that you think is going to play aggressively and is going to be a handful to deal with. Perhaps could be particularly interesting on Ravenwing Talonmasters, which look like a nightmare to deal with in the first place. These enhancements all seem to have a benefit if your unit or other nearby units are battle shocked. I do find that kind of strange to be honest. Maybe it's just representing the Dark Angels doing well under adversity, but it seems a little bit odd to actually reward them for basically having their morale break and being pinned down by enemy fire. Just seems like a strange design decision, particularly with the general trend of trying to make battle shock more meaningful. In any case, if the unit dies while it is battle shocked, they get to come back with 4 wounds remaining, so coming back even harder from adversity there, I suppose. Looks like a very good enhancement though, if you've got a character that's playing aggressive. Next up, we've got Stubborn Tenacity. This one's +1 to hit for the bearer's unit after taking a casualty, and then a further +1 to wound for the bearer's unit if you're battle shocked. Maybe a little bit less reliably good, as it's dependent on your opponent triggering both of those if they actually care too much about it. Still maybe not too bad on a big durable unit that you think might take casualties but not out and out die. Could be handy to throw on a character that's going into a big Terminator squad maybe. Moving on, we've got the reincarnation of the Heavenfall Blade. This one's a nice solid combat boost, +1 attack, +1 strength and +1 damage to the bearer's melee weapons there. For generic characters, it seems particularly strong for things like Power Fists and Thunder Hammers, or maybe even a pair of Lightning Claws in a pinch. Strength 9 and damage 3 fists or hammers seems good though, particularly if you're getting an extra attack out of them. Again, for the battle shock benefit, it looks like it goes up to +2 strength attacks and damage if the bearer is battle shocked, though I feel like that's only ever going to happen a minority of the time. Finally, we've got quite a nice ancient one, the Pennant of Remembrance. Previously this was a -1 damage one, which was very nice on Terminators. Now it looks like they can just trigger that in the fight phase anyway for 1 CP. Instead, this one gives you a 6+ feel no pain for the unit. Really quite useful on big tanky Terminator profiles, and you can take this one either with the Primaris Ancient, Terminator Ancient, or the Blade Guard Ancient, but it doesn't look like you can take it in the Deathwing Command Squad. Still though, it looks like the Deathwing Command Squad could still be joined by a Terminator Ancient potentially. You would have 2 banners in one unit, and getting a 6+ feel no pain on any Terminator unit seems rather good and could be worth the price of inclusion alone. Does seem like perhaps the best place for it, either that or maybe an Ancient attached to some Deathwing Knights. For the battle shock benefit, it goes up to a 4+ feel no pain if the unit's battle shocked, massive durability boost there, and an odd reward for Deathwing Terminators failing morale, which it does seem that they can now do. They're no longer fearless. Overall, all of these could be potentially very solid depending on points costs. I feel like the most out and out standout one is probably Shroud of Heroes. Getting a character just to come back to life and then do a final turn of damage dealing is well worth the include. Though I guess you are kind of gambling on the unit getting killed though if you actually get value out of it. Otherwise, the mastercrafted style blade weapon still seems to be really nice if it costs little enough to make it worth it on a captain or something, and the pennant seems very powerful on a big Terminator block. It'll be interesting to see if the Dark Angels players decide to go for this formation more so than the Gladius. I feel like potentially a couple of the Stratagems are maybe more powerful, particularly the -1 damage and returning fire. As mentioned though, I do feel that Grim Resolve is far weaker than Combat Doctrines, with the ability to get Advance and Charge or Advance and Shoot, plus the Tactical Doctrine. Let me know what you make of the comparison down in the comments. Datasheets next though, and broadly speaking the Dark Angels datasheets haven't changed enormously. There are a few things in and out though. As mentioned, the detachment has removed restrictions on things like Sternguard and Vanguard veterans, so you can have those alongside Dark Angels armies now, which is kind of cool, particularly with the new and snazzier Sternguard that are released in Leviathan. Otherwise for the datasheets, nothing here appears to be battle line. The Ravenwing and the Deathwing ones, I suppose, might potentially get it if they're in other detachments in the Codex. For this more balanced Dark Angels force, that doesn't seem to be the case though. I think you can still spam bikes and Terminators fairly hard though, just by taking the different variants of the datasheets. Still looks like you've got enough units to take far more Terminators than you actually have points for. Otherwise, for datasheets added and removed, it looks like, similar to the Firstborn Command Squad that we saw in the main Space Marine Codex, the Deathwing and Ravenwing Command Squad mini characters have all been consolidated into one full unit. Means that you won't have Ravenwing Apothecaries or Deathwing Champions or whatever just running around on their own. They get to fight as a combined unit now. I feel like particularly the Deathwing Command Squad looks interesting for the benefits it brings to that unit. Otherwise, the only major casualty of the updates are Interrogator Chaplains. It now looks like there's no unique datasheet for them anymore. They're just represented by the chaplain rules from the Codex Chaplains now. Though while they won't be called Interrogator Chaplains on the datasheet, and they might lose an attack and wound, you still can basically fill them, just use the regular Chaplain datasheets. You still have options for Terminator ones, Jump Pack ones, and On Foot ones. Only a few slightly niche war gear combinations look like they might be affected. I was kind of interested to see whether or not the Deathwing Strike Master made it into the new index, given that he's basically a squad leader who's just a bit jumped up as a Deathwing Lieutenant, but looks like they have kept him around. And otherwise, in terms of new datasheets to the index, we've got the full Ravenwing Command Squad datasheet now. Previously, there was a Deathwing one that you could fill with very small units. That's now been reinterpreted as the one with all the characters in it, so it's a bigger unit now. And Lionel Johnson, the Primarch returns to the Codex proper now, is actually in the index rules rather than having his own independent digital download. Finally, for overall datasheet rules, it looks like the Ravenwing get their Jink reinterpreted as just a flat 5+ invul save. That happens at range and melee. Definitely a nice to have, but you can't advance to make it a 4+ anymore. And having no actual names Jink mechanic does mean that you wouldn't get the 5+ invul on units like land speeders or bikes or anything, which I guess just aren't really balanced for it in the core Space Marine datasheets. I think that 5+ invul is very nice to have though. It means that things like land speeder vengeances, dark talons, and black knights are just a bit harder to kill. For the Deathwing, it looks like they don't have any sort of unified special rule for them. They don't all get some sort of new version of the Inner Circle rule, as they had for their Transhuman for the vast majority of 9th edition. They just mainly get the equivalent that's on their datasheets now. Inner Circle is just a rule for the Deathwing Knights, it seems, though it is a single very powerful rule. Talking of Deathwing though, let's go through unique datasheets. We'll start with the Deathwing unique units and characters, then do the Ravenwing unique units and then characters, and then finish up with Lionel Johnson and all the rest of the special characters for the Dark Angels in general. The Deathwing Terminators probably aren't going to be having too bad a time of it, given that the Terminator profile is a bit tougher and a bit more durable. Toughness 5 and a 4+ invul regardless of equipment, and on their datasheet it says they basically count as a regular Terminator squad for any characters that can attach to them, so they're not weirdly locked out of the generic options from Codex Space Marines. For the most part, these guys are pretty much the same as the standard datasheet for Terminators in standard Codex Space Marines. 5 to 10 models in the squad. Their Deathwing rule is the same one that allows them to ignore modifiers to the hit roll and also get a bit more of a damage buff against the Oath of Moment targets, and they have access to pretty much all of the same equipment, barring the teleport homo, which they lack. The only other major difference between them and the regular Terminators is the war gear choices that they can take. As before, they can mix and match ranged and melee weapons really quite freely. They can have Assault Terminator things like Lightning Claws or Thunderhammer and Storm Shield, or mixed in with a unit that say has some Chain Fists and Storm Bolters. 1 out of 5 of them can take the Terminator heavy weapons. There's the standard Assault Cannon, Cyclone and Heavy Flamer, but they also get a Plasma Cannon option as well for a bit of unique Dark Angels flavour. Might be a fairly risky one to overcharge though. You will be risking the life of an entire Terminator on the hazardous roll. The Storm Shields give you 4 wounds on a model, so it could be handy to have some of those. You could choose to tank a first damage 3 attack on a Storm Shield one maybe. Seems like having the choice could just make the unit a little bit more durable as a whole. Finally, the unit gets the option to take a Watcher in the Dark along. The rules for this one are listed on the Deathwing Knight datasheet, but it basically allows them a single phase of 4+ saves against mortal wounds. Really quite a big deal on Terminators, as that's often going to be one of the best ways to deal with them. Overall, I'd say that these guys seem really solid. They do seem pretty much flat superior to the regular Terminators in my opinion. The choice of mixing weapons seems really quite good, plus the teleport homer I think has kind of limited value maybe. Free rapid ingress is kind of nice and could mess with your opponent's movement, but I think I'd rather have the save of defense against mortal wounds, which could certainly kill Terminators fairly quick. They also have a counterpart datasheet in the Deathwing Command Squad, and this one basically has a very similar unit setup, except you must take 3 specialists within the squad. The Deathwing Ancients, Apothecary and Champion, you have to take all 3. I feel like these guys could be a really interesting unit for having leads attached to them. They seem to be pretty ideally set up for a very dangerous unit moving into the midfield. The Champion gives them a +1 to advance and charge, pretty excellent on Terminators that are a little bit slower and might struggle to make melee. And if you're playing them in the Gladius Task Force, they could also get advance and charge with the Assault Doctrine. The Champion also allows them to use that Heroic Intervention stratagem for free if it makes sense to, and he's got a melee weapon that can snipe characters. The Ancient gives you +1 objective control, which again is pretty good for a unit that could well be fighting over objectives, and the Apothecary keeps his resurrection tricks, restoring a miniature to the squad in each command phase, which both punishes attacking the unit and also has positioning shenanigans, so you could put them at the front of the unit and make your charge just that little bit shorter. Look really good to be honest. I feel like with an extra character or 2 attached, these guys could be utterly scary. They've got a lot of innate buffs going for them and could take further character buffs really well. Finally for the Terminators, and also looking really quite cool, are the Deathwing Knights. Again 5 to 10 models per unit, and as they always have Storm Shields they get 4 wounds base, but they don't have the improved +1 to their save on the 2+ anymore. These guys are just going to be fantastically tanky, as they just always have -1 damage built in. Damage 2 weapons are going to be rubbish against them, and damage 3 will drop down to damage 2. They're going to be a hard squad to kill. For combat weapons though, the Maces of Absolution have maybe got a little bit less general purpose. They all get 4 attacks, hitting at Strength 6, AP 1 and Damage 3. The flat 3 damage does mean that any hits that go through will absolutely be felt hard, and particularly good against elite infantry perhaps, but Strength 6 and AP -1 does mean that they're going to struggle a bit against high toughness armoured targets. The flail though I think looks really quite nice. 5 attacks on the Master, and that gets a bonus AP, even if it is only 2 damage. The flail gets sustained hits 1 though for extra hits on 6s, and also devastating wounds to fish for those 6s for the 2 mortals on 6s. That just looks like a fantastic anti-everything weapon that's going to be felt by anything that it flails. Overall seem pretty solid. They're still going to have enough raw might to punch down the vast majority of units that try and attack them, and they do look like a phenomenally tanky unit moving up the board. Could be very scary with the 6+ feel no pain in the unit, and you could even have something like a Dark Shroud nearby to give them more toughness. For the Deathwing characters, we've got Grandmaster Belial and a Strike Master. Belial can lead any of the Terminator squad variants. As expected, he gained toughness 5 like the rest of the Terminators, though I would say that his personal combat stats did take a bit of a hit to be honest. He dropped down to damage 2 from damage 3, and he lost the auto wounds on 2+ ability he has for precision, so he's just a bit better at killing enemy characters now, which does seem like a bit of a downgrade. Weirdly, he looks like he's going to be a more intimidating combatant when he's on his own compared with if he's being supported by a Deathwing Knight squad, and that reason is his strikes of retribution. Every time the opponent makes a melee attack against him, then you get to roll a dice after they've attacked. He can roll up to a maximum of 6 dice like this, and for each roll of a 2+, the enemy takes a mortal wound in return. That really is an absolutely brutal special rule, and sort of feels like you could use a big unit's attacks against him. Most squads in Warhammer 40k are going to be trying to attack him with at least 6 attacks, so that means that you should on average just be able to slap back with 5 mortal wounds every time he is attacked directly. It seems if the opponent has to clear him in melee, then they really need to go in for the kill. They don't want to do a half a job and have all that damage back. Otherwise, he interestingly makes his Terminator squad into a bit of a sniping unit, which I think is quite interesting. Any critical hits from the Terminator squad gain the precision keyword, and that means that even hails of Stormbolter fire or Cyclone missile launches or something could potentially be very nasty to snipe down enemy characters. You could even combine it with that lethal hit stratagem so that all those precision attacks auto wound too. If there's a key enemy character that could get gunned down by a hail of Stormbolter fire, looks like having Belial on the board could be fairly intimidating. Will be interesting to see if he makes the cut. Seems to be a specialist in killing characters now. His strikes of retribution I think is very powerful, but the fact that it only triggers when he doesn't have a bodyguard I think makes it a bit more underwhelming. Lastly for the Deathwing we have the Strike Master, Again, he can lead the Terminator squad variants, and basically as a lieutenant equivalent, he basically can join a squad even if there's a captain or chapter master attached to it. Otherwise, he's got a fairly solid flexible choice of Terminator equipment. He can select a Mace of Absolution as well, should he wish to, and he also gets a fun personal buff. If he's fighting any enemy units that are half strength or less, he gets +1 to his hit and wound rolls. Really though, his main value is granting lethal hits to the unit that he's with. Really quite nice on Hails of Stormbolter fire, plus Terminator power fists and things. Being kind of middling strength, that'll really help them punch up against tough targets. Definitely could be solid enough if his points costs are worth that damage buff. Ravenwing next, and while quite a lot of the rank and file Ravenwing will just be using the Codex Space Marine datasheets, here we have the Black Knights, some of their shock elites. Their squad sizes have dropped slightly, they're down to 3 to 6 models rather than up to 9, maybe just a tiny bit less scope for enormous stratagem plays and things there I guess, but still enough to deal a big punch. For character attachment, these guys can be joined in the same sort of way as an Outrider squad, basically just joined by characters on bikes as you'd guess. These guys get a 4+ invul save for Jink just permanently now, and they have objective control too, so are a little bit better at taking points than the Terminators are. Bikers did drop a pip of movement as well, going into the new Space Marine rules. Weapons wise, they attack with their Plasma Talons, 2 shots out to 18 inches at Strength 7 AP2, or you can overcharge for normal Plasma profile, and they also have the Rapid Fire 1 rule now rather than Assault, which means that if you get within 9 inches, they'll get 3 shots instead. I feel like they might have actually profited a little bit from the new hazardous rules. It's only a 1 in 6 chance to lose a biker if you fire these off now. In theory, they could have been rolling more dice with their Plasma Talons before. You can't re-roll hits with a captain now though, so I guess there's positives and negatives. Otherwise, the grenade launcher is a little bit more punchy, and I guess doesn't come with a chance of killing you, though still seems a bit underwhelming compared with Plasma Talons to me. In combat, their Corvus Hammers have had a bit of a switch around. Weapon skill 3+, strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1. Gained a bit of AP but lost a bit of damage. Overall though, they still seem like a fast and fairly scary unit. Decent generalist profiles at range and in melee. Finally, they've got a rule called Knights of Caliban. This one gives them a damage buff against tough stuff when they charge in, anti-monster or anti-vehicle chosen in the fight phase. Your hammers will be wounding them on a 4+, even if they are only damage 1. Not going to make them into a true anti-tank or anti-monster unit still, I think, but a full squad of these should shave off something like 5 or 6 wounds off a lot of them, and that's not too bad after you might have hit with them with plasma fire already. The other option from the same box is the Ravenwing Command Squad. These are basically the mirror image of the Deathwing Command Squad, built from a base squad of Black Knights, and you still get up to 6 models in the unit, starting out with the 3 specialists. Again, the specialists give you the exact same buffs. The Apothecary can revive a model, the Champion gets a better melee weapon with damage 2, and allows you +1 to advance and charge and free heroic intervention, though he doesn't snipe characters this one apparently. And the Ancient helps out with a little bit more objective control, putting them up to 3 each. They do miss out on the rule to auto-wound vehicles and monsters on a 4+ though, so they might just be a little bit less exciting when they're attacking big stuff. I feel like their benefits are maybe just a little bit less exciting than maybe the Deathwing were. I guess the +1 to advance and charge gives them a bit more threat range. Could be very interesting with Samael leading the units as he gives them advance and charge. You need land speeders first though, and the Ravenwing Dark Shroud has been buffed a little. Previously, its icon of Caliban just gave you a -1 to hit for the units within 6 inches of it. Now that's been boosted to a -1 to hit, and also granting you the benefit of cover. Overall, a pretty solid combination of damage removal rules there. Again, it's going to depend on its points cost quite heavily. If it's cheap enough, then having this towards the centre of your army is going to be really quite effective. Terminators are already tanky to take down, and having these debuffs on them is even better. Ideally, it would be quite nice if you could hide the Dark Shroud out of line of sight, and then still apply the buffs to the unit. It also comes with just a little bit of threat of its own sort as well. Gets either a heavy bolter or assault cannon. It's a bit more durable with toughness 8, 10 wounds and a 5+ invul. And this one actually got a small movement boost from 12 inches up to 14. Most things in 10th edition went down a bit in movement, so that doesn't hurt. For the more aggressive Landspeeder, we've got the Landspeeder Vengeance. This one's got similar profile and movement changes, and rather than bringing durability, it instead brings massive Plasma Storm damage. On the supercharged mode, it gives you d6+1 shots, strength 9, AP -3, and a flat damage of 3, plus the Twin Link special rule as well, so you're re-rolling wound rolls against tough vehicles and things. Definitely a solid anti-tank weapon with those rules. It's also got Blast as well, so it can lend a hand against hordes too if it needs to. I'd say perhaps the new hazardous rule is actually kind of helpful for it. It's only a 1 in 6 chance to take 3 mortal wounds, and you can command point reroll that, though even if you had to take it, it is survivable. Overall, it just looks like a generally strong gun, and mounted on a fairly long range and fast platform that should hopefully almost always be able to get the alpha strike on the enemy. This guy's big rule is that it gets to fire when a nearby unit dies. If a friendly Adeptus Astartes unit within 6 inches of it is destroyed, the model can use this ability, and then immediately fire its Plasma Storm battery and its secondary gun all into the enemy unit that just killed your friendly unit. That's potentially a huge amount of damage just literally for free for the enemy killing a unit, and I feel like it incentivizes you running a squadron of these guys. You could have 3 of them, and then when the first one goes down, you get to fire with the other ones. Seems like a fairly brutal storm of plasma death all around to me. Next up, we've got the Dark Angels planes. Both of these basically have the new flyer rules with the hover keyword. Either you have the choice of being the more traditional flyer with now unlimited movement, but that requires going into strategic reserves and turning up turn 2 if you can wait that long. Otherwise, you can deploy them with hover, start them on the board, but their movement's only 20 inches. The new Dark Talon profile's toughness 8, 11 wounds, and has the 5+ invul save built in. It does no longer come with the -1 to hit as standard for flyers though. A lot of them do seem to have lost that, though not the Nephilim apparently. The weapons don't maybe seem to have enormously changed. The Rift Cannon still seems to be fairly effective. 18-inch range now, and strength 16, AP -4 and damage 3. It gains an extra shot, but rather than get mortal wounds every single time it makes a successful wound roll, it now only gets the mortal wounds on the roll of a 6 with devastating wounds. Perhaps just a little bit less general purpose. Seems absolutely excellent into tough vehicles or 3-wound infantry though. For clearing hordes, it's got a crazy amount of Hurricane Bolter fire. These really do look absolutely brutal now, potentially even more so than before. It does indeed get 2 sets at this profile, not just one that's twin linked. All of them do count as twin linked though. At 12-inch range, you're basically firing off 24 shots and re-rolling all the wound rolls. Should absolutely obliterate the majority of horde units there. Besides its guns though, as well as that, it also has the Stasis Bomb. The Stasis Bomb deals D3 mortal wounds to a unit that you've moved over, and then on top of that it also debuffs their movement. Roll a dice and on a 1 to 3 they can't advance and fall back, and then on a 4+ they just flat out must remain stationary. It does basically guarantee no fallbacks though if you want it, and this could be really quite a scary thing for an enemy unit. Potentially use this on a unit that's nearby what you want to charge. Charge and kill the units that you want to with a Deathwing Terminator squad maybe, and then use the consolidates to tag the next enemy unit and then get them locked up in combat. Looks pretty brutal, and then you could hopefully kill that following enemy unit in their turn. Even just the chance to make the enemy unit remain stationary completely though could be absolutely huge. If you can reach a big important Death Star style enemy unit, then having them just completely unable to move for a turn is going to be absolutely awful for them. I guess often that might well just be a little bit on the late game side of things though. You're probably not getting it right from turn 1 if you're starting on the board. 20-inch movement usually won't be able to fly over enemy units on the first turn, and otherwise if you are going full on flyer mode it's not happening until turn 3. Overall though, definitely looks generally scary. Massive great big anti-tank gun, really quite superb anti-horde clearance gun, potentially horrendous movement debuff. All of it sounds like a scary flyer indeed. Next we've got the Nephilim Jet Fighter. This one's got similar Dark Talon changes to its profile, and despite being a bit more of an aircraft, it still has the hover keyword, so you don't have to zoom it around too quickly. Unlike the majority of the flyers that we've seen so far as well, it does also have a -1 to hit built in for this one called Lightning Fast Maneuvers. It also gets a -1 to wound for fly units trying to target it as well, maybe going in with its role as a bit of a dogfighter. It is just fly units in general though, it's not just enemy aircraft that it's debuffing. Otherwise though, this plane is just mainly about the direct fire guns. It either gets the choice of the Avenger Mega Bolter or the twin las cannons. The Mega Bolter has picked up sustained hits, and the las cannons are not twin linked fortunately. Then it's got some Black Sword missile launchers with 2 shots at strength 8, AP 2 and damage D6 now, a fairly solid improvement on that profile, and it also picked up Anti-Fly 2+, quite good for taking out any hovering enemy skimmers. Overall still puts out really quite a lot of shots if you want it to. Certainly looks like you could get a lot of strength 5 damage 2 hits if you wanted, or go a bit more anti-tank mode. Leading the Raven Wing, we've got Company Master Samael. On his jet bike, he can either lead a bike squad, outrider squad, Black Knights, or a command squad, so basically anything that can be joined by bikes normally. Stats wise, he's a tiny bit slower than he was before, lost a wound and moves 12 inches, and his melee's taken a bit of a side grade. The Raven Sword now no longer gives you boosted strength on the charge, and instead gets sustained hits too, so perhaps a bit better against infantry, but a bit worse against heavies. Besides his standard things like his storm bolters and his plasma cannon, he also grants the unit that he has advance and charge. and also allows them to shoot after advancing as well, both of them being pretty nice buffs. I feel like that probably does just make him most suited to running with either the Black Knights or the Ravenwing Command Squad. Being able to happily advance, get those Plasma Talons in range, then make a charge seems excellent. He'll definitely add solidly to their threat range and their combat ability when they get there. Otherwise, he's got really quite a fun special rule as well. If an enemy unit wants to fall back from him, besides monsters and vehicles, they have to test Desperate Escape even if they're not battle shocked. So in theory, if the opponent chooses to fall back, then they lose a third of their unit on average. Though I guess if it's that big a deal to them, they could just remain in combat and perhaps try and countercharge you or something. There's even a -1 bonus to the test if the enemy is battle shocked, so a decent chance to lose models there. Seems kind of handy and quite disruptive. I think it's not an unlikely situation that the Ravenwing shoot and charge and then have some enemies that are still in combat with them, or they pile into something else, and that rule could come up. Looks pretty fun though, certainly cool to have Relic Space Marine jet bikes in full-fledged 40k. Finally, for the Ravenwing, we've got the Talon Master, the character Landspeeder, who packs a twin heavy bolter and twin assault cannon. With his special rules, for some reason he's got the leader tag, but that might be an error, as it doesn't look like he can actually lead anything, and Landspeeders don't even come in squadrons anymore. Instead, it looks like the way that he works is that he is within 3 inches of fly vehicles or mounted units, and then he gains the lone operative keyword, so you can't shoot him at greater than 12 inches. Just to make sure that he's completely and utterly frustrating to try and catch up with, he's also got a rule called Master of Maneuver. Once per turn, if the enemy makes a normal advance or fallback move within 9 inches of him, then he gets to make a reactive counter move of 6 inches, provided he's not in engagement range. Could certainly mean that sometimes the opponent is forced to move that close to him, and then he just runs away, so you're no longer within shooting range of him, and if the unit's a combat unit, you might also ruin his charge. Otherwise, his ranged firepower has been toned down a bit. Perhaps a good idea, to be honest, given that he just had some absolutely brutal damage output in 9th, and the opponent usually couldn't do much about it. Those twin-linked weapons have indeed picked up the twin-linked rule, which is generally a bit less effective than firing 2 sets of the gun. His ballistic scores also dropped a little bit. He's hitting on a 3+ now rather than a 2+. Again, another fairly big cut to the damage output, even if it is fairly safe character protected shooting. Finally, he also buffs other Astartes units with either fly vehicles or mounted units nearby. They all gain ignore cover on their shooting attacks, perhaps a fairly relevant rule given that 10th edition hands out cover saves fairly easily. Overall, I do think he looks interesting, probably a little bit less threatening given that his damage outputs got cut by a fair bit. Still could be an interesting fast moving character to take down at targets of opportunity though, and could be kind of annoying to catch up with provided you've got a fair few Ravenwing units on the table. Finally, we've got the chapter commander of the Dark Angels, Lionel Johnson, and the leading characters of the chapter. The Lion's rules felt kind of underwhelming in 9th edition for his points cost, though it does look like he's got massive ability increases in 10th, perhaps on a similar sort of parity with Gilliman, who also saw these kind of changes. The Lion's toughness 9, a 2+ save, and the Emperor's shield actually is genuinely good now. It gives him a 3+ invul save and -1 to wounds. Between all that, the vast majority of attacks are just going to bounce straight off the shield or not even wound him. You're generally going to need high damage anti-tank weapons to hit him with, and even then if 1 or 2 of those sneak through, then he could always just CP reroll. As a character as well, it's not even as if you're going to be able to just directly target him with a big amount of anti-tank fire. He gains the lone operative rule if he's nearby Dark Angel's infantry, so you'd have to try and get close with some fairly powerful shooting to really threaten him. Otherwise, he's got a combi weapon in Armor Luminis that works a bit more like the older versions. He can choose to shoot 2 attacks with plasma shots or 4 shots with bolt shots. Kind of fun, though not really his main purpose. The majority of his threat certainly comes from his melee profile, I think. His blade fealty strikes with 8 attacks at strength 12, AP 4 and damage 4, or can have a pretty mighty sweep mode with 16 attacks with sustained hits, strength 6, AP 3 and damage 2 to cut through some 2-wound Space Marines. It's pretty brutal damage and very general purpose, and what's more, he also has the Fights First keyword as well. That means that even if the opponent has charged him rather than the other way around, it should mean that he gets the jump on them. Between that and the lone operative thing and being enormously tanky, it just means that he's just a very, very hard model to kill. Finally, his Primarch of the First Legion rule gives him the choice of 3 different buffs chosen in the command phase. He can give you an aura of +1 to hit in the fight phase, could be nice enough on Terminators maybe. He can choose to basically activate those watches on his base and give everyone within 6 inches a 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds. Quite nice if you think that you're going to be lit up by quite a lot of those next turn. And then perhaps the most interesting one is one called All Secrets Revealed, which annoys the enemy stratagems used on units within 12 inches of him. Then the Dark Angels player gets to basically generate a command point and also the opponent's got to take a battle shock test and can't use the stratagem if they fail it. Definitely the most fun of the rules, but also seems a bit niche and just might do nothing. If your opponent's really worried about it, they can just choose not to use a stratagem on the unit within 12 inches. Overall though, generally just looks a lot more solid than he was before. Glad to see that he's finally changed the batteries on the Emperor's shield and it seems to be working at full effect now, and fights first with that combat profile is pretty brutal as well. Next up for the Chapter Master of the Dark Angels we have Azrael. He's got really quite a nice choice of units that he can choose to lead, kinda similar to Calgar. He can go in Assault Intercessors or regular Intercessors, Blade Guard Veterans, Infernus Squads, Stern Guard, or quite interestingly Hellblasters. I feel like out of that list, Blade Guard and Hellblasters are perhaps some of the biggest wins. Big damage dealing units like that are the sort of ones that you really want your characters to be buffing. As he's not in Terminator armor though, he can't run with Deathwing Terminators sadly, a bit of a shame as some of the primary Dark Angels damage dealers. Otherwise for his weapons, the Sword of Secrets has been taken down a peg. It's only strength 6 and damage 2 again now, rather than being briefly up to strength 7 and damage 3 with his latest datasheets. The Lion's Wrath Combi Plasma does seem kinda nice against elite infantry though, getting devastating wounds and anti-infantry on a 4+, for 2 mortal wounds each time you wound at that range, and 3 shots at 12 inches. Finally, for what he brings to the table, he gives his unit sustained hits 1, so a nice flat damage increase there, very nice to have. The Lion's Helm will still give the unit a 4+ invul save, that's excellent on any 3 wound Space Marines, I guess a bit more relevant on things like Hellblast or Stern Guard compared with Blade Guard who already have that, and on top of that he also gets his Watcher in the Dark as well, which like the Deathwing datasheets also gives a once per game 4+ protection against mortal wounds, and that combines quite nicely with the invul save I think. Overall a solid set of buffs. I feel like it might well be best used on Hellblasters perhaps, provided they're at least somewhat efficient, and also similar to Calgar, just by having him on the board he generates you 1 command point per battle round, and in 10th edition that has some pretty serious value all of its own. Overall seems pretty solid, does feel like a little bit more of a buffing and range type character, as opposed to desperately needing to seek melee, though he can certainly lend a hand if the enemy gets too close. Next we've got Chief Librarian Ezekiel, really quite a popular choice recently with Dark Angels, with things like Fights Last and removing Auras and Obsec out there. In 10th edition looks like Ezekiel can join the Firstborn units, Assault Squads, Command Squads, Tactical Squads or Vanguard Veteran Squads. He's got a fairly busy datasheet with a fair bit going on. He's got a psychic shooting attack called Mind Wipe, which is just a single shot to try and snipe a character. On normal profile, it's just strength 6, AP -2 and damage d6, but if you go for the Focus Witchfire, which is hazardous, it also gains anti-character 4+, as well as the precision and devastating wounds. So basically, if you can hit a character with this within range, then on a 4+, you're getting d6 mortal wounds against them, which is going to cut through their defenses. Still a bit unreliable, as you could fail that 4+ or roll low on the damage, but it does definitely have the potential for one-shotting a lot of powerful characters straight out of a squad. Otherwise, Traitor's Bane is his force weapon that gets anti-chaos 2+. He'll be a bit more threatening in melee against those sort of matchups I suppose. And then for his other leadership and psychic abilities, he hands out a battle shock test at 8 inches in the shooting phase. He gives his unit a 4+ save against psychic attacks from his psychic hood. He just flat out gives his unit +1 attacks, so that could be quite nice with assault squads or vanguard veterans maybe. And then when he's slain, his Book of Salvation means that all Astartes within 6 inches take a battle shock test. In most armies that could be quite a significant debuff, and I guess it could still be bad for the Dark Angels in their own way. But seeing as quite a few of their abilities actually key off having battle shock tests failed, it does have its positives in the Unforgiven Task Force at least. Overall looks pretty solid. Maybe the command squad might be a decent enough place for him, given that they can actually take some fancy melee weapons. Overall I think he just looks quite a solid leader between all the different things that he can do. Next up, we've got Chaplain Asmodai, who can lead the same choice of units. He does chaplain things with a built-in leadership of 5+, which is quite nice against Battle Shock, I suppose. A Crozius Arcanum with 5 attacks, and he gets 3 small bonus attacks called the Blaze of Reason, all at strength 4, AP 0, damage 1. A tiny bit of anti-horde there, though it does have the precision, extra attacks and anti-character keyword, so if he is fighting an enemy unit with a particularly weak character hidden within it, he might have the potential to stack some saves on them. Otherwise though, for his actual combat buffs, he has Exemplar of Hate as his litany thing. This allows you to re-roll the hit roll in melee against your chosen targets. That could maybe be quite nice for anything else that stats with critical hits. Perhaps in particular the lethal hit stratagem that the Dark Angels can have going on. If there's at least one unit somewhere on the board that's battle shocked, you could be auto-wounding everything on a 5+ and re-rolling to try and get more 5s. Otherwise, if he does manage to kill any characters, he can drag them off for interrogation for 1 command point. Looks like that does have to be him personally though, and not just his unit. And then finally, he has the chance to hand out some battle shock in the fight phase. Enemy characters within 6 inches have to take it, and at -1 leadership as well. I guess if you have this guy screaming at you to repent in your face, it's probably going to give you a bit of a pause. Due to the timing of it, it's often just going to be relevant for enemy stratagems and things though. If it prevents an interrupt or powerful combat stratagem though, then all well and good. Again, maybe a command squad could be one of the more interesting things for him to lead. I feel like again the choice of units that he can lead is just a little bit tricky for actually making his abilities work. Finally, we have another one of the Dark Angel's Primaris characters in Company Master Lazarus. As his Primaris, he can either lead the Assault Intercessor Squad, Inferno Squad, Intercessor Squad, Stern Guard Veterans, or Blade Guard. No Hellblasters for him though. In general, he feels like he's a very anti-psyker character. If they did seem to be very popular into the meta, then I suppose he could be more interesting for that kind of counter. His Power Sword is quite a dangerous one with Enmity's Edge, Strength 6, AP 3 and Damage 2, but it also has Anti-Psyker 2+, so wounds even big ones very easily. Otherwise, he grants his unit Fights on Death on a 4+, that'd be quite nice on a Blade Guard veteran squad I suppose, and his Spirit Shield also gives a 3+ Feel No Pain type save against psychic attacks and mortal wounds. Fairly nice durability boost that one. Again, probably seems best with Blade Guard, and maybe a little bit unsold compared with a Space Marine Captain giving you free stratagems in your unit. I think that you'd have to be pretty guaranteed that you were running into Psychers to really make him a particularly competitive choice. If Grey Knights and Thousand Sons get amazing though, then Lazarus could be quite tempting. With Lazarus done, that brings us to the end of our Dark Angels units in 40k 10th edition then, or at least the unique ones from the index. As with all of these index reveals, we're still going to be waiting on points costs to see what's actually efficient or not, but I feel like there's a fair bit to be excited about just with the datasheets and the stratagems, with at least a fair few interesting rules. I feel like the Ravenwing Dark Talon looks like a very spooky plane to have on the board, pretty big damage against most things plus that stasis bomb. The Deathwing Command Squad and Deathwing Knights both look like solid choices for stomping into the midfield and having their own advantages, and maybe Samiel doing advance and charge things with a big unit of Black Knights also looks very threatening and looks like you could alpha strike the enemy quite hard with that. Otherwise, Azrael and Ezekiel both look interesting for squad leaders potentially, Azrael particularly with some Hellblasters perhaps, and Lionel Johnson's new stats are pretty immense. Hopefully his points cost will work out that he's actually worth fielding this time round. I'll be interested to hear what you guys make of all this though. How positive are you feeling about the Unforgiven in their new 10th edition incarnation? Let me know down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I'll be trying to make as many of these index reviews as I can, and I guess I'll be aiming to cover the Blood Angels next, hopefully later in the day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. If you have been finding any of these useful, any support over there is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.